This program is made possible by listeners who choose to support Frontlines and Backrooms. You can join our community of supporters through the link in the episode description. Thank you.
From Lisbon, Frontlines and Backrooms podcast. Your host, Vladimir Bobatik.
Welcome to Frontlines and Backrooms. Today we are joined by Dr. Roger Higginson, a former UK civil servant with decades of experience in European and international policy, particularly within multilateral institutions. He holds a PhD from the University of Sussex, where his research focused on the history of the British Mandate in Palestine. His work today examines territorial conflicts on Europe's borders from Ukraine to the Middle East, as well as the strategic logic behind Iran's foreign policy and the evolving global balance of power. In this conversation, we explore how Western perceptions shape conflict, why de-escalation has become so difficult, and what a multipolar world means for countries like the United Kingdom. Professor Higginson, thank you so much for your time and welcome to Frontlines and Backrooms.
Thank you, Vladimir. I must point out it's only doctor. I'm not a professor. But
You're absolutely right. My apologies for that. Your area of expertise is the history of the Middle East, specifically Iran. What do we in the West understand wrong about that country? What would be the most misleading perception that we have or simply don't understand about Iran?
I would suggest that as far as Western perceptions and misperceptions are concerned, there are quite a few parallels between both Iran and Russia, because in both cases, the West seems to have convinced itself that both of these countries are inherently aggressive and expansionist and a threat. But if you look at the world from the perspective of either Tehran or Moscow, and you consider their history over the past, say, 200 years, they have both suffered so many invasions and so many attacks that they are convinced that all they are doing is defending themselves. So tragically, we have a high degree of miscomprehension between both sides. And I think it's fair to say, I don't think it's overly cynical, because this point was raised as far back as the end of World War II, that there is such a large military industrial structure in all of our societies today, with businesses and think tanks that really have a vested interest in conflict. It's quite difficult, even for a strong leader at the presidential or prime ministerial level, to push through a policy of deconfliction. And so you tend to get a default always to initially criticizing and ultimately to demonizing the other party. So a bad situation becomes even worse, it becomes more dangerous, and you see the conflicts we have today, both in Ukraine and now in the Middle East.
How we can de-escalate the situation if we are painting Iran as simply terrorist states ruled by mullahs who are just want to destroy everything? How can we de-escalate if we put the whole country only in one perspective, in one dimension?
Well, of course, with that qualification, if we put the country only in one dimension, sadly, the answer is we cannot and we will not de-escalate. Ideally, we would have policymakers and leaders in Western capitals who would take the time to sit down and just familiarize themselves with the headlines of Iran's history. I initially suggested over 200 years, but in fact, you could take it over 100 years back to World War I or thereabouts. And you would see, specifically in the case of Iran, the extent to which the British in particular had controlled parts of its territory, had decided who was its prime minister. You have the infamous Mossadegh affair of 1953, I think it was, when they wanted to nationalize their oil production. You will see also the way Russia invaded during the Second World War. And I think another point more recently, which tends not to get discussed in the media today, is the attack that Iraq under Saddam Hussein made on Iran in the years immediately following the revolution of 1979. It wasn't Iran who started that war. It was undisputably Saddam Hussein and Iraq who started it. So they were the innocent and aggrieved party. If we could only begin to understand that a bit more, then I think you can start along the path uh, of de-escalation. But at some stage, of course, you're going to have to take head on one of the biggest reasons why there is so much aggression against Iran. And that's because Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has effectively made a career politically out of accusing the Iranians of wanting an atomic bomb to drop on Israel. And you will be aware that there's quite a lot of media commentary at the moment, which is asking why did America decide to go in militarily against Iran right in the middle of negotiations about its nuclear program, which the hosts geographically were Oman. Their foreign secretary has issued a statement publicly saying that those negotiations were going quite successfully. So why is it that we had suddenly this military attack? And I think most people agree it's because Netanyahu was pushing for it, and he was using the influence of the Israel lobby at Washington to, in effect, force President Trump's hand.
You mentioned Prime Minister Mohammed Mossadegh. He was overthrown in the coup organized by the CIA in the covert operation known as Ajax operation. Reza Pahlavi was installed as Shah. Is there any realization in the West that those actions, oppression from Pahlavi, actually led to 1979 and the Islamic Revolution? Are we aware that the West is partly responsible for where we are at the moment?
You can certainly, I think, make a plausible argument and a comprehensible narrative across the chronology of that period, 1953, 54, up to 1979. But you run into the problem that I think, and this is not unique to the West, but politicians in all countries tend not to be very ready to accept their collective responsibility for developments which they find unpalatable. If you take the case of the Pahlavi dynasty in Iran, there is absolutely no doubt that it was extremely repressive, which is why opposition in the 1960s and 70s was slowly building up to it. But there's also little doubt that the British, but much more the Americans and the CIA, for example, were actively helping Pahlavi to suppress his people. And that, of course, was carried out in the context at the time of the Cold War and a desire to keep Iran on board, if you will, and in the Western camp, because they feared the spread of Soviet influence in the country, particularly because, as we need to recall, in those decades, American dependence upon Middle Eastern oil was much greater than it is today. But I think in practical terms, the chances of getting anybody in the West outside of academic research communities to admit that certain Western actions contributed ultimately to the revolution in 1979, the chances of that happening are really rather slim.
I want to touch one more topic from the region, Lebanon. Israel occupied Lebanon from 1982 to 2000, and then they withdraw.
Yes, correct. That's the origin of Hezbollah.
Exactly. Now they are moving towards the Litani River and beyond, making what they call a buffer zone. Defense Minister Israel Katz said that Israel is going to destroy all the villages next to the border. Will Israel this time around go to occupy or annex that part of Lebanon permanently? How this situation looks to you?
Let us, Vladimir, take your question, which is very pertinent, but separate it into two between intention and practice. My reading of the Israeli Defense Minister Katz is that the intention to essentially depopulate southern Lebanon south of the Litani River and create a buffer zone is certainly there. And I think you can trace these ideas and these concepts, which are part of the old Eretz Israel, Greater Israel concept, at least as far back as the Second World War and the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. So the intention, I think, is undoubtedly there. And as you've just pointed out, there is evidence that the process has already started by the forced depopulation of the villages close to Israel's northern border and the forcible eviction of the inhabitants of those villages further north. What happens subsequently is an interesting question because you can ask the same thing about the West Bank, as we used to call it. In other words, the territory that was taken over by Israel following the 1967 war. They've only formally annexed East Jerusalem. They haven't formally annexed the West Bank, but de facto, they have complete military control over it. And they're content for it to remain on the map, if you would, as disputed territory. And it doesn't concern them because they know that they have full control. And they know that nobody else is very likely to try and forcibly liberate the Palestinian population living there. I would suggest that you'll see something very similar in this expansion between the de jure border of northern Israel up to the Litani River. First, they depopulate it. They destroy whatever habitations or structures they wish to destroy in the area. You may presume that there will then be a certain population of that territory by Israeli citizens, initially military, but subsequently civilian, possibly along the lines of what you've seen around the Golan Heights and up towards the northeast border with Syria. But will they formally claim to have annexed it? I would suggest probably they won't. Because once again, for similar reasons, they won't necessarily feel the need to. Why should they? Because they'll have de facto control. But it'll be an expansion and it'll be an expansion that you can see. I would argue you can then arc it across because you've got southern Lebanon, you've got the Shabar farms and the promontory of the Golan Heights into southwest Syria, sorry. And of course, now de facto, you have control over parts of the territory of southwest Syria. So you have an arc of territory, which is effectively a buffer zone. Now, you could argue that this is a very similar mode of thinking to the Russians, because the Russians want to have territory which is a buffer zone, which is one of the reasons why we have the war in Ukraine. And as you've observed in some of the work that I've submitted to the UK Parliament concerned with foreign affairs, we in the UK, and not only the UK, are suffering from a bit of, to put it mildly, a double standard in our response to Russia's desires to create a buffer zone, taken in contrast to our lack of response to Israel's creation of a buffer zone.
The UK Prime Minister said that the war in Iran is not UK's war. He is focusing on energy caps and domestic storm. But you've argued that UK alignment with the United States is so slavish, as you said, that the UK essentially functions as a puppet. If the United States ever hits Iran's oil and desalination plants, can Prime Minister Starmer realistically maintain this not our war stance while the global economy and the UK's energy security are at risk?
I think, notwithstanding the problems of the relationship between the UK and the US, which, as you know, really developed following the end of World War II, when the British had lost their empire, their influence was in decline. And so having what came to be known as the special relationship with the United States appeared a simple and easy solution as a way of maintaining influence. Um, the world has changed significantly, though, since the stability that was created at the end of the 1940s. I don't think Starmer has a huge amount of choice but to stay on the sidelines, because most of his own political base in the Labour Party, even if not at the senior level of the cabinet, but in terms of, if you will, the foot soldiers politically, they oppose the war and they oppose the aggression on Iran, and they even impose the use of British military bases by American bombers. I don't think, though, that he is able to do more than he is at the moment, if for no better reason that it's become abundantly clear over the past month or so that, for example, British naval power is in a very, very parlous state. We simply don't have sufficient firepower in battleships or aircraft carriers or destroyers to make an effective difference either in the Eastern Mediterranean or in the Arabian Sea and up to the Gulf of Hormuz. So I think whether he likes it or not, he's essentially going to sit and watch. He'll continue to allow the one it's in the news, the Royal Air Force Base at Fairford, to be used by the Americans for their long-range strategic bombers. And that will be very much it. And I would suggest that you could sense that that's his approach, because every few hours on the news at the moment, we're hearing about um, statements concerning cabinet meetings to try and mitigate the effects of price rises, petrol price increases, and maybe shortages of petrol. So all the emphasis of the public statements of the UK government at the moment is placed on the domestic situation here in the UK. There's one or two nice phrases about the importance of reopening the Straits of Hormuz, but there's a complete lack of any indication of military involvement. And no doubt he's looking across his shoulder at heads of government across the European continent who are also, for one reason or another, taking a very similar position.
You know that President Trump isn't happy with the UK. He mentioned that Prime Minister Starmer is not Winston Churchill. What this tells you, especially as you mentioned, is that the UK-US alliance is the most important one after the Second World War. What does this tell us about the current relationship between the US and UK?
Well, the current relationship is is not as good as I think the British would like it to be. Um, but in the longer term, I think you have the obvious question to ask is how long will this individual, Trump, be in power, and what is likely to come next? Now, I don't think there's any chance, and this is a personal view, that even a future Democratic president in the United States will revert to the approach that Joe Biden had. I think those days are over, but I don't think that a future American administration is likely to take, if I could use the word, such an extreme position as Trump does at the moment, who appears to work as much on his personal perception of other people and his reactions to them as he does to thought out policies. So I have a suspicion, and this may not be unique incidentally to the UK, I think it's probably also the case in other European capitals, that the governments are figuring out how to avoid inflaming the situation anymore and hoping just to ride out the crisis. In the short term, the crisis of the war in Iran, and the medium to longer term of what else might come up until the end of Trump's second term.
Well, we still have more than 2 years until the end of President Trump's second term.
Yes, which is a long time in politics. I accept that. Yes.
Indeed. So there is plenty of time for more damage in the relations with allies. Dr. Higginson, is that relationship repairable? Will relations with allies like Canada, the UK, and European Union be possible to repair after President Trump leaves White House?
I think in principle it probably is. Um, if you can break a relationship, then logically you can make a relationship as well. So yeah, it does cut both ways. Um, I'm trying to think, is there a historical parallel where friends have become enemies and they became friends again? Um, yeah, you might say Russia between the Crimean War and the First World War. It wasn't a very comfortable relationship, but we did manage to patch up the hostilities as we went into World War One. So it's not impossible. I think part of your question might find an answer in the issue of the future of NATO, because NATO is the organization that at the moment is joining the UK, nearly all of Europe and North America in a single military alliance. Um, what I find interesting there is that, of course, United States under Trump is taking quite a different view about Russia than Trump's predecessor did. So if you could get a degree of rapprochement between the United States and Russia, then I would see potential at the same time, if the politicians are sensible, in a degree of rapprochement between us here in the UK and Washington, because we wouldn't need the Americans so much if there wasn't so much hostility with Russia. And I think this is another dimension to the UK-US relationship that is not sufficiently examined by the mainstream media. Because at the moment in the UK, you have a prime minister who refuses absolutely to engage in any way with Vladimir Putin, who almost goes as far as saying that we're at war with Russia. But of course, the corollary of that is if you really believe you're destined to a conflict with Russia, then you desperately need the United States, because you can't find Russia without the United States supporting you. And this is where I think my personal opinion is that on this issue, Starmer has boxed himself into a corner. Not uniquely him. I think you can see this across the European Union. They've all convinced themselves, from Kaja Kallas to Ursula von der Leyen, that Russia's about to invade. So they're all terrified of doing anything that will upset Washington. To put it diplomatically, it is an unsatisfactory situation that we find ourselves in at the moment. There's far too much in terms of knee-jerk reactions to situations, and there's far too little in careful, considered thought about what is the best path to craft forward.
You questioned whether the UK and US relationship should be even strengthened, given the resurgence of America First. So when Starmer says not our war, is he asserting British sovereignty, or is he simply admitting that the UK no longer has the military or political capacity to even influence a president who barely listens to him?
Yes, it's an interesting question because I think it reveals a bit about the psychology of Starmer as a person. We need to bear in mind that before he entered the Labour Party and became its leader and subsequently Prime Minister, he was a director of public prosecutions in the UK. So his view of the world has been shaped by the idea that everything is controlled by the law. He's a lawyer by background. And I know this is not unusual for politicians in general, but I think for him it has had a particular influence. Now, if you consider, as the earlier part of our discussion, that he's understandably at pains not to make a difficult situation with Washington even worse, what he has not made explicit is that this decision to attack Iran was not based on, for example, a UN Security Council resolution. And the decision was not made in consultation with European allies or with the UK. So, from the perspective of a lawyer, there was not a good basis for suddenly coming in and saying, well, we'll back you anyway, um, because this goes against the UK's publicly stated commitment to values, although you are aware that there's a separate discussion to be had about how and in what circumstances it applies those values. So I think his instinctive reaction as a lawyer that this was not the right thing to do has been bolstered by the practicalities of the weakness of British military forces currently and their incapacity to have any real influence on what happens in the Middle East region anyway. Now, when you ask that type of question, I think you then lead into another issue, which is not fully discussed in the mainstream media, which is to what extent has the money, and there have been significant sums given by the British government to Ukraine, to what extent has that money that's gone over to support Ukraine and its war in Russia paradoxically weakened the UK's capacity to defend itself or to be influential in other parts of the world? I would submit that that question, at least publicly, has been ducked. And it's all very well to say that the money for Ukraine is separate from the UK defense budget. But now I will speak as a former government official in the UK. You can be quite sure that one way or the other, if the Treasury has to find £10 billion for Ukraine, it will claw it back by hook or by crook from the Ministry of Defence's budget. Or in some other form, there will be another restriction.
The European Union gave billions of euros to Ukraine in the last couple of years for budget spending, but also for ammunition and weaponry. So now, when we have this situation with the United States thinking or threatening of leaving NATO, it seems that European leaders went into panic mode. Possible Russian invasion, lack of resources and military power, armies that need heavy investments, and the realization that the United States might not be there. Is this what puts European leaders into panic mode?
I think, Vladimir, the short answer is yes, but I would suggest that the answer has to be calibrated according to timescales. If you're talking about the short term, then yes, there are weaknesses, though I must add at this point, I am by no means a military strategic expert. It's not my subject. But I think it's reasonable to conclude that because we've had 1949, we've had 50s, we've had 70, 75 years of reliance on the United States as the driver of NATO and as the out and away the single largest contributor to NATO budget and forces, then was it to withdraw that support, then Europe would be in a very weakened position against a potential Russian threat. So I agree entirely that at the moment in across European capitals, there is a degree of panic. However, if you take a longer perspective, and forgive me, I'm quoting from memory here, I think you will find I did do some work on the budget contributions of NATO, excluding the United States, and the figure of about 450 billion comes up as the European and Canadian contribution to NATO. The Russians, they spent about 145, 150 billion. If you look at the GDP of Russia and the GDP of the European Union is significantly richer. Even notwithstanding the fact that Russia, of course, has oil and gas to sell, and Europe does not have these primary raw materials. But the money is here in Europe. What is not here in Europe, I think, to the same extent, is the physical capacity to develop military equipment, which clearly has existed in the United States ever since World War II. And you have very large American companies capable of producing pretty much whatever you want in terms of missiles and battleships and airplanes. That's what's missing in Europe as of today. If we do decide that we're going to develop our own capacities for production and produce many more companies like the one that's in the news at the moment, Rheinmetall in Germany, then of course the balance will begin to shift somewhat. So I think all this is partially a question of timing. But there again, there are 2 points that I'd like to make. One is, although for obvious reasons, Ukraine will want to tell the rest of Europe that if it loses the war against Russia, that Russia will sweep west and recreate the Soviet Union. The facts are that since the creation of NATO in 1949, Russia has never attempted to invade a NATO member state. All of its military activity has been around the shoreline of the Black Sea, the Sea of Azov. It's been localized. So I think that we should not necessarily fear the threat of a Russian invasion. It is true that Russia is a nuclear power, but then so are the British and so are the French. And hopefully, however hysterical politicians become, they will not become so deranged that they'll start a war head to head with another nuclear power where there is a very real risk of escalation. And I think people could be usefully reminded that the reason the Cold War remained cold was that both sides had nuclear weapons. Hopefully, this situation will continue.
Let's go back to Iran. You argue that hostility and sanctions actually consolidated the power of the mullahs by giving them a foreign demon to rely against. If the UK stays on the sidelines until a peace deal is concluded, does that help the UK's long-term interest in Tehran, or will the UK still be seen as a little Satan in the eyes of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, regardless of what Starmer says?
It's a very important issue that you're raising, but I have to say I'm pessimistic, and I can give you quite a recent example here. I agree with you absolutely that if we sit on the sidelines of what is essentially an American-Israeli attack on Iran, then in principle, there should be a certain capacity to start building some sort of relationship with Iran, um, and hopefully influence them, ideally, onto a more peaceful path. But I think we have a problem here of psychology, which is in some ways rather similar to the hostility that the British political class are expressing towards Russia. Now, you may be aware that here in London, about 2 weeks ago, it was really quite recent, there was an arson attack on three ambulances that were run by a volunteer Jewish group not far from where I live in North London, in a Jewish suburb named Golders Green. And within a very short period of time, the police were suggesting that there might have been an Iranian connection to the attack. But so far, the people that they've arrested, and security cameras indicated, I think that there were three individuals concerned, were respectively British citizens and Pakistani citizens. So there wasn't an Iran connection. But the accusation had been made quite publicly by the Metropolitan Police, and you can only guess at the behest of the government that there had been an Iranian connection, and that the Iranians were responsible for it. And this very annoyingly illustrates the depth of ignorance there is in some quarters in this country. Once again, not only this country, that because Iran demonizes Israel, that it's anti-Semitic. I happen to have a friend who is Iranian and Jewish, and the Jewish community in Tehran um, live quite peaceably and they're not persecuted. The reason that Iran demonizes Israel has nothing to do with the fact that Israel has Jewish citizens. It has everything to do with the fact that Israel is perceived as a sort of advance guard of the American military. It does, after all, receive between $3 and $4 billion worth of American military equipment every year. That is the reason why Iran is so hostile to Israel. It's the relationship between Tel Aviv and Washington which creates the hostility. It's nothing to do with Jewish people as Jews. It's all about geostrategic considerations that you seem to have got inserted into the Western discourse that somehow Iran is anti-Semitic, but it's not. It's entirely different considerations. So long as you have that level of aggression, even if we do sit on the sidelines from this particular military operation, I'm pessimistic about the chances of rapprochement. And you could see it a little earlier, a couple of years ago, for example, there was a dual national Iranian British journalist, Nazarene Sarari Radcliffe, who was arrested in Iran. We later found out because she was trying to interview journalists to work for the Reuters news agency in Tehran, which the Iranian government were not very happy about because of the American connection. She finished up in jail, and there was an awful lot of going toing and throwing between the British because the husband, understandably, was trying to raise the case here in the UK, and he was demonstrating in front of Downing Street and getting himself publicity, which you cannot blame him on a personal level. Eventually, the lady was released and came back to the UK. But if you listen to the exchanges in the House of Commons at the time, they were all about this lady being a British national. They didn't point out that, yes, she was a British national, but she was also an Iranian national. And everybody knows under international law that when you're in the other country, you fall under the laws of that country. And she was born in Iran, and her native language was Farsi, it wasn't English. But all these points were overlooked in the media coverage. So if you don't have the desire or the capacity to make use of not being involved directly in military hostilities, I remain pessimistic about the creation of more healthy and normalized relations. And I think that's true both of Iran and of Russia as far as the UK is concerned. It seems to permeate the whole of the political class. It goes across most of the political spectrum, with the exception of the extremes on the left and the right. And it certainly goes through all of the security organizations and most of the established think tanks as well. The only exception, as I said earlier, would be the academic research community, but they are small and politically, for better or for worse, we are not influential.
Dr. Higginson, for decades, United States power rested not just on military strength, but on the belief that it upheld a rules-based order. If the United States now openly disregards those rules, when they become inconvenient, as Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has said a couple of times, is this the end of the American soft power, or does it simply mark a transition to a more openly transactional form of influence?
I think it's a little bit both. It's difficult to see clearly when we are in the middle of what appear to be profound changes in the world operates. But very, very crudely, I think in the structures created at the end of World War II, the so-called Bretton Woods agreements and the institutions that were established, you had the projection of soft power, but possibly insufficient recognition that the soft power was backed up by American military hard power. There was, if you will, an American nuclear umbrella and very, very extensive, powerful American military forces, but they were mostly held in reserve. And so the soft power gave the impression of being influential. I would suggest partially because the hard power behind it was implicit and covert more than explicit. But of course, as the decades rolled on, and I think in particular as you got towards the Gulf Wars in the Middle East, um, the hard power became more apparent. And you'd anyway seen it in Korea and Vietnam. Now, I think coming to your second point, or the second half of your point, this more transactional approach being taken by Washington seems to come from a realization or a calculation that the so-called unipolar moment of the 1990s and the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the United States was essentially unchallenged globally, that moment has gone. A weakened Russia has, over the years, become stronger, whether we like it or not. And China has become wealthier and more powerful. So I would suggest that the calculation in Washington is, let us be more pragmatic. Let us not spend so much time promoting values, which was done much more in previous decades, and let us consider which parts of the world we want to make an impact. And we will do that with a combination of the use of force and a transactional approach. And you can see that, I would suggest, to take an obvious example, with Russia and the Arctic. One of the reasons they don't want to waste their time on a war in Ukraine is that they consider that there are more important things that can be done elsewhere. So that's what's changed, and that's why, as you will be aware, I've argued in some of my work for the for the British Parliament, that the UK itself should take a more pragmatic approach to the world and shouldn't put so much emphasis on promoting its values when it is so clear that those values are not universally applied.
On the other side, we also have UK with their own soft power, diplomacy above all, and then credibility and institutional trust, which were the trademarks of the UK. But when a close ally openly threatens actions that legal experts describe as war crimes, like bombing desalination plants, can soft power survive alignment with the hard power that appears to ignore the rules it was once claimed to uphold?
Well, it becomes ever more challenging. I agree with you completely, but this is the basis of my own argument, that not only is it not in the UK's interest to insist too much or to emphasize too much its values in terms of its soft power, but also it shouldn't be too close to any one center of power. Um, it's interesting, I find, if you take a longer term historical perspective. I think the British are still slightly at a loss because they've come off 200 odd years of being an imperial and very dominant power, and this is no longer the case. But if you go back to, say, the 18th century, the UK was not a global power, and in fact, it had to tread rather carefully because France and a century before Spain were both had larger populations and were more powerful than the UK was. But the UK nevertheless learned to survive. As a trading nation, you might argue it doesn't have a lot of choice. I think you can find some data on the percentage of food that the UK produces for its population. And it's now it's certainly below 40%. 60% has to be imported. particularly as the population has risen quite significantly over the past few decades. So we have to trade. Now, if we're going to trade, logically, we should try to keep on good terms with everybody with whom we are going to have trading relationships. And I would suggest that means possibly that we do not make too many moral judgments about the way other countries conduct their internal affairs. And I think this is one of the areas where the so-called development of the multipolar world probably plays to some of Russia's strengths, because Russia is by no means squeamish in terms of the countries it engages with if it considers it is in its interest to do so. I mean, you could argue that it's amoral. But on the other hand, if you read, for example, Henry Kissinger's works, at a time when the West was very happy to say how important values were. I mean, Kissinger was, as you know, extremely hard-headed in terms of functioning according to interests, as opposed to any sort of ethical code. And in terms of the UK and its history, if you go back to the 19th century and Palmerston and Castlereagh's, then either Prime Minister or Foreign Secretary, they would always insist on having a policy that reflected British interests. And I'm sure they would be absolutely horrified by the uncritical way in which the UK and many European countries have run into the support of the government in Kiev and the war with Russia. Because they would have pointed out that a country over 1,000 miles away is hardly of strategic importance to the British Isles. But alas, that is not the perception that pertains at the moment.
But opposite to Kissinger, you argued that credibility, as you said, depends on consistency. So if the UK defends international law, for example, in Ukraine, but appears selective or silent in the Middle East, for example, regarding Israel, does that create a double standard that erodes British influence globally? Or is it simply how power has always operated beneath the language of rules?
I would argue that it creates a perception, and perceptions are very important, of a double standard. I think this is very important for the UK and and I think to a similar extent for France, because they are preeminently the two former European imperial and colonial powers with historically very extensive amounts of territory overseas under their control. If we move into a world which is now judged to be multipolar, and therefore where second order powers, third order powers, if you could use that concept in a hierarchy of powers, have a choice about which of the top powers they identify with or engage with, currently China, Russia, America, then countries which in particular, which are former colonies, are likely to be hostile to a power that claims to be guided by values, but which demonstrably does not apply those values equally in similar situations. And I think you have put your finger on it very well in the example of the support for Ukraine and the condemnation for Russia can be juxtaposed against largely silence and ineffective comments concerning the aggression and hostility carried out by Israel in the Gaza Strip, in parts of Syria, and now in Lebanon. And a lot of countries in what we now refer to as the global south, I think are going to make that comparison, and that they're going to bring an accusation against the British, which in fact is a very old accusation, and it is comes from the expression hypocrisy is an Englishman. This dates back to at least the 19th century, that phrase. Sadly, I think it may be quoted against us again.
Dr. Higginson, we are approaching to the end of our show. And before we finish the interview, I have 5 short questions for 5 short answers. First, does the UK still shape events or just respond to them?
Currently, if I'm honest, I have to say it primarily responds rather than shapes.
Is this not our war or just not our responsibility?
I would suggest both because the leading players in the Middle East vis-a-vis Iran are undisputably Israel and the United States. We don't have time for a more detailed discussion about the decline of British influence in the Middle East, but it has been significant ever since the Suez Crisis of 1957.
Does soft power still matter in today's world?
I would suggest yes, because not all relations between states, we might say, thank goodness, are based purely on hard power. Sovereign nations have choices, so if they have a perception that another country or countries have things to offer which are worthwhile, possibly in terms of education systems, possibly in terms of the institutions by which they operate their countries, then yes, that can be influential. So yes, there is a role for soft power, and I would suggest there always will be a role for soft power. We don't live in an entirely Hobbesian world where everybody is fighting everybody else all the time.
How would you describe the current state of the United States credibility?
I think so long as you have a president who says one thing one day and another thing another day, then the credibility is likely to decline. But paradoxically, because the issue is so focused on one particular individual, albeit a very powerful individual, then I think in time that credibility can be rebuilt.
And is this conflict making the world more stable or less?
Undisputably, it makes it less stable because you have ever-growing confrontation in the Middle East. You have some very, very worrying statements coming out of certain Israeli government ministers, for example, that Turkey will be next on the list if Iran is defeated. This will mean that Russia and China will want to make sure that Iran is not defeated. So the chances of the conflict spreading and growing are really quite significant. We should not underestimate this.
And to wrap up everything, was this war a mistake? And how can we include Iran again in the international community without labeling it as a terrorist state? I'm asking you this more like somebody who knows and understands that country. It is not only about the religion, it is not only about financing the proxies in the region. Iran is much more than that. How we are going to do this?
It's really a very great challenge given the level of hostility that's shown in the West. We can only hope, I think, that future governments in the West, after this current war is over, will be sensible enough to accept that some form of cohabitation with Iran and its government, however unpalatable that may be, is preferable to the sorts of level of hostility and, incidentally, destruction of economic activity that you're seeing from the closure of the Straits of Hormuz. If that is the alternative, then people, I hope, will realize that the better path is a path of engagement which does not moralize so much. And we can also hope, incidentally, that the Iranian government on their side will become somewhat less repressive domestically. But one of the paradoxes of this war is, of course, is that their position has been strengthened. and you look at all the specialized news feeds, you can see the thousands of people demonstrating in the streets. So the regime has become stronger. It hasn't become weaker.
Dr. Higginson, thank you so much for your time. It was a real pleasure to talk with you today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
In the next episode, we speak with Randa Slim, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute and one of the leading analysts of Hezbollah and regional dynamics. As the region moves between escalation and negotiation, we look at what is actually happening beneath the surface, from Iran and Israel to Lebanon, where the consequences are already unfolding. Is this a temporary crisis or the beginning of more permanent shift in how war is fought in the region? If you value long-form conversation that go beyond headlines and sound bites, consider to subscribe and support this project. It is because of the listeners like you that we are able to continue this backroom dialogue independent and in-depth. You can find the link to join in the show description. You've been listening Frontlines and Backrooms. Thank you and keep looking beyond the noise. Until next time.